Hello and welcome to episode 17 of Evidence for Belief, a series which examines evidence for the existence of God. In this episode, we've finally reached what is arguably the most convincing evidence for the existence of God, the miraculous life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. In the previous episode, we examined the historical evidence that proves that Jesus was a real person in history and that no serious historian disputes this. But in this episode, we're going to examine the extraordinary accounts of his miraculous life. Because if these accounts are true, if Jesus really did work these miracles and ultimately rise from the dead, then these events represent extremely convincing evidence for the existence of God. The four Gospels, those are the four biblical accounts of the life of Jesus, recount a stunning catalogue of at least 37 miracles. These include 21 miracles of healing of blindness, leprosy, quadriplegia, withered limbs, undefined paralysis, uncontrolled bleeding, fevers, and general unspecified illnesses. 5 miracles of provision, turning water into wine, multiplying food to feed 4,000, and then again to feed 5,000, and 2 miraculous catches of fish. 4 miracles of exorcism. 3 miracles of control over nature, including calming a storm, walking on water, and withering a fig tree. And finally, 4 miracles of resurrection, resurrecting Jairus' daughter, the widow's son, Lazarus, and finally Jesus himself. Now, as well as these explicitly detailed miracles, the biblical accounts indicate that Jesus performed many other miracles which went undocumented. In John chapter 20, verse 30, we read, Jesus performed many other signs being one of the words for miracles, in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book. Indeed, the Gospels make oblique references to some of these many other miracles. For example, in Matthew 4:23, we read, Jesus went throughout Galilee, teaching in their synagogues, proclaiming the good news of the kingdom, and healing every disease and sickness among the people. In Matthew 12:15, we also find this reference. A large crowd followed him, and he healed all who were ill. So, what are we to make of these claims? Many skeptics argue that these accounts are mythological embellishments fabricated by his early followers in order to perpetrate their new religion. According to this argument, Jesus was just an ordinary man who said some wise things and developed a popular following, but after his death, his followers supposedly deified him, in other words, declared him to be God, and they concocted stories of supposed miracles and fabricated the myth of his resurrection. This view was expressed and popularised by the liberal Episcopal Bishop John Spong, who claimed that the miracles recorded in the 4 biblical Gospels were a late developing part of the Jesus story, end quote. The problem with this view is that it is overwhelmingly refuted by the criteria of historical reliability. Let me talk you through this. In assessing whether an ancient document is historically reliable, historians apply multiple tests. Now, these tests are commonly referred to as the criteria of historical reliability. The most commonly employed criteria are as follows. 1. The criteria of time gap. 2. The criterion of embarrassment. 3. The criterion of multiple attestation. 4. The criterion of the absence of protestation. 5. The criterion of corroboration by hostile critics. And 6. The criterion of author credibility. Now, time doesn't permit a full explanation of each of these, but a brief overview of several of the criteria will help you to understand why we cannot lightly dismiss these miraculous accounts as fabrications. So let's look at 2 of them together. The criterion of time gap and the criterion of the absence of protestation. In historical terms, time gap refers to the amount of elapsed time between the actual historical event and the time of writing. In other words, when that event was eventually recorded. In order for successful embellishment to occur, a significant amount of time has to elapse between the event and its eventual writing down, so that there would be very few, if any, eyewitnesses left alive who could refute the embellishment. Now, Professor A.N. Sherman White was a world-renowned Greco-Roman historian who, among his many scholarly works, analysed ancient historical embellishments. He concluded that minor embellishment requires a time gap of at least 2 generations, while major embellishment required at least 200 years. In other words, mythical embellishment within the lifetime of eyewitnesses would result in overwhelming protestation and refutation. Let me give you an example. At the time I'm recording this episode, it's about 80 years since Winston Churchill led the Allies to victory over Adolf Hitler and the Nazis. Now, just suppose for a moment that I decided to write a biography of Winston Churchill. And in that biography, I concocted all kinds of fanciful stories of him working miracles, raising people from the dead, walking on water, and ultimately rising from the dead himself. You know, I would be very quickly shut down as a fool, and my written account would be overwhelmed by a flood of literary rebuttal, instant protest, giving factual corrections. And in another 2,000 years' time, anyone investigating my ridiculous claims would uncover a veritable sea of indignant literary refutation. So, even though more than 80 years has elapsed since the historical event, I still, to this day, could not get away with embellishing the life of Winston Churchill. Now, in the case of the life of Jesus Christ, the first 3 Gospels, Matthew, Mark and Luke, were written only 30 to 35 years after Jesus' death, and the Gospel of John was written another 25 years later. Now, these 4 Gospels drew upon even earlier written accounts of the life of Jesus that are no longer extant, some of which historians believe were written within the first few years of Jesus' death and resurrection. In other words, the Gospel stories were written within the lifetime of the eyewitnesses to the events that they describe. So, what was the response of the ancient world to these stories as they were written and circulated? Well, the response of the ancient world to these gospel stories was remarkable. The Gospels were met with resounding silence. There was no refutation. There was no protest. And the reason for this is quite simple. No one could refute the Gospel accounts because there were still thousands of eyewitnesses alive who had witnessed Jesus' miracles. Hundreds had witnessed him raise people from the dead. Thousands had witnessed him heal the sick, the blind, the paralysed. Thousands had witnessed him multiply food in order to feed the hungry. And even Jesus' death and resurrection from the dead was witnessed by thousands. But we'll save a discussion of the resurrection in particular for the next episode. Both the extremely short time gap and the complete absence of protestation are 2 vital criteria in establishing the historical veracity of the gospel accounts of the life of Jesus. Let's have a look at criterion number 3, the criterion of multiple attestation. Now, this criterion simply means that the more independent sources there are that report the same event, the more likely that event is to be historically true. This principle applies in many areas of life today. For example, when emergency services hotlines are contacted by multiple people reporting the same incident, perhaps a fire or an accident, they can have great confidence that the event is real and not a hoax. In the case of the biblical account of Jesus' miracles, there is both internal and external multiple attestation. In terms of internal multiple attestation, 15 of the 27 books of the New Testament refer to the miracles and the resurrection of Jesus. And these were written by 8 different authors. Now, this is not to be undervalued, because these 8 writers wrote from a position of geographic and temporal dislocation from each other. Their books were written hundreds of kilometres distant from each other and often many years apart, and this makes their corroborating testimonies particularly impressive. Now, you might not be particularly impressed with that because, after all, these 8 writers all had skin in the game, didn't they? They were followers of Jesus, right? Well, of course, they're going to confirm his miracles. So let me now turn to a couple of external sources that confirm the miracles of Jesus. And these are writers who definitely did not have any skin in the game. I mentioned these briefly in the previous episode, but they are worth digging into a little more deeply now. The first one is a general reference by Thallus, a 1st century Greek historian. He described the supernatural darkness and the earthquakes that accompanied the crucifixion of Jesus, recorded in all 3 synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark and Luke. Now, Thallus's reference is quoted in the early 2nd century by the historian Africanus, and this is what he writes. On the whole world there pressed a fearful darkness, and the rocks were rent by an earthquake, and many places in Judea and other districts were thrown down. Thallus calls this darkness an eclipse of the sun in the 3rd book of Histories, without reason it seems to me. Now, although this is only a very brief reference, it is significant in describing the extraordinary supernatural events that surrounded Jesus' crucifixion, including Africanus's comment that the darkness cannot adequately be explained as a mere eclipse of the sun. He is hinting there that something supernatural was occurring. But let's now move to a much more significant reference. This is the Jewish historian Flavius Josephus, and he provides another source of corroboration when he describes Jesus as a worker of wonders. This is in his book, The Antiquities of the Jews, 18.3.3. And this was a 1st century phrase, this worker of wonders, for a miracle worker. His book also includes a comment about Jesus' resurrection, which I won't bother quoting because it is widely believed to be a later insertion by a Christian copyist. But this statement about Jesus being a worker of wonders is widely regarded as authentic, originating from Josephus himself. And I think that's significant because Josephus was a Jew and not a Christian. But an even more impressive external corroboration of Jesus' miracles is found in the Babylonian Talmud. And this is where we overlap with another criteria of historical credibility, the criterion of corroboration by hostile critics. The underlying idea of this criterion is that hostile critics, that is, people who are hostile to a particular point of view, are the least likely to affirm or validate any aspects of that point of view. Now, in our legal system today, when a hostile critic or hostile witness does confirm something that they are naturally disinclined to want to confirm, it's considered to be an incredibly powerful and persuasive form of evidence. In our case in regard to Jesus, in assessing whether Jesus really did perform miracles, both the previous quote by Josephus and the quote we're about to look at in the Jewish Talmud represent corroboration by hostile critics, by Jews whose religious beliefs kept them opposed to Jesus, and yet, despite their opposition to him, they could not deny the reality of his miracles. The Talmud is a Jewish sacred text that was being written at the time of Jesus, and it mentions Jesus on several occasions, even referring to his miracles. The Jewish rabbis who were writing the Talmud could not deny his miracles because they'd been witnessed by hundreds and, in some instances, thousands of people. Instead, they attributed them to the power of the devil, and they accused Jesus of sorcery. For example, in the Babylonian Talmud, it states, on the eve of the Passover, Yeshua, that's the Hebrew name for Jesus, Yeshua the Nazarene was hanged, and that is a term that was often used to describe crucifixion because the victims literally hung from the nails in their hands and their feet. He was hanged, they wrote. And then it goes on and says, before the execution took place, a herald cried, he is going forth to be executed because he has practiced sorcery and has enticed Israel to apostasy. This is an extremely significant reference. The accusation of sorcery is a reference to Jesus' miracles. Even Jesus' enemies, you see, the very ones who crucified him, could not deny the reality of his miracles. The only way they could discount them was to attribute them to evil sorcery. And that, in fact, is why they eventually crucified him. His claims to be God and his regular miracles were a major thorn in the side of the Jewish authorities, who considered him to be a blasphemer. Ultimately, they could neither silence him nor staunch the constant flow of miracles, so they simply executed him. This is extremely strong historical corroboration by hostile critics for the miracles of Jesus. Even the Jewish authorities in Jerusalem did not and could not deny Jesus' miracle-working power. Thus, Frank Morrison, in his landmark book, Who Moved the Stone, states, "The fact remains that the personal ascendancy and repute of Jesus during his own lifetime was immense. The stories of his cures of the blind, the paralytic and the possessed were widespread. They came from all parts of the country and were apparently implicitly accepted even in high quarters in Jerusalem." The acknowledgement of Jesus' miracles by the Jewish authorities is also evident in their interaction with Jesus in an incident prior to his crucifixion. The Gospel writer John records a dramatic exchange between Jesus and the Jewish authorities in Jerusalem shortly before his arrest. Jesus had arrived in Jerusalem to celebrate the Feast of Dedication and was preaching in the outer courts of the temple. And so John writes, "His Jewish opponents picked up stones to stone him. But Jesus said to them, 'I have shown you many miracles from the Father. For which of these do you stone me?' And they replied, 'We are not stoning you for your miracles, but for blasphemy, because you, a mere man, claim to be God.'" The incident concludes with John's statement, "Again they tried to seize him, but he escaped their grasp." Now, what is particularly intriguing about this incident is the lack of denial by the Jewish authorities regarding Jesus' miracles. It would have been the perfect opportunity to deny the miracles of Jesus if they were mere fiction, stories that were concocted by his followers. Therefore, the most logical explanation for the lack of denial at this point by the Jewish authorities is that they simply could not refute the miracles because too many people had witnessed them. This confrontation with Jesus took place in a public courtyard with a large crowd of onlookers, many of whom would have already witnessed Jesus' miracle-working power. The authorities would have looked foolish denying his miracles. Well, let me conclude. If we are looking for evidence of God's existence, the miracles recorded in the Bible and corroborated by external sources must surely rate as compelling. The miracles of Jesus provide us with extremely convincing evidence of the hand of God at work in our world and clear corroboration of God's existence. The evidence for the historical veracity of Jesus' miracles is so strong that even the famous liberal scholar Rudolf Bultmann once conceded, and I quote, "But there can be no doubt that Jesus did such deeds, which were in his and his contemporaries' understanding miracles. That is, deeds that were the result of supernatural divine causality. Doubtless, he healed the sick and cast out demons." If these biblical accounts of the miracles of Jesus are true, as I believe they are, then we have solid historical evidence confirming the existence of God. And so that brings me to a final point. You can't dismiss Jesus as merely a good moral teacher. His miracles won't allow you to do that. Jesus did not merely wander around the countryside, uttering nice platitudes and coining wise sayings. His miracles are extremely confronting, and so are his claims that accompanied them. Throughout his brief ministry, he made a series of extraordinary claims. He claimed to have existed eternally prior to his appearance on earth. That's in John 8:48 to 59 and John 17:15. He claimed to be able to forgive sin, Matthew 9:5 and Luke 7:48. He claimed that he would judge all mankind at the end of history, Matthew 25:31 and Luke 18:8. He claimed to be God, John 8:58 and John 10:30. Now, of course, merely claiming something does not make it so. Psychiatric wards are full of people who believe that they're all kinds of things. But there are two factors that cause us to sit up and take notice of Jesus' claims. Number one, his obvious sanity, and number two, his extraordinary miracles. In regard to the latter, one must ask, what further actions would we expect God to perform if he manifested himself to us in human form? The miracles of Jesus, and as we shall see in the next chapter, his resurrection from the dead, surely force us to seriously consider his claim of divinity. We can't simply dismiss his claims as the ravings of a madman. C.S. Lewis once wrote, "I'm trying here to prevent anyone saying the really foolish thing that people often say about him. I'm ready to accept Jesus as a great moral teacher, but I don't accept his claim to be God. That is the one thing we must not say. A man who was merely a man and said the sort of things Jesus said would not be a great moral teacher. He would either be a lunatic on a level with the man who says he is a poached egg, or else he would be the devil of hell. You must make your choice." C.S. Lewis continues, "Either this man was and is the Son of God, or else a madman, or something worse. You can shut him up for a fool, you can spit at him and kill him as a demon, or you can fall at his feet and call him Lord and God. But let us not come to him with any patronising nonsense about his being a great human teacher. He has not left that open to us. He did not intend to." For more information, you can check out my books, which are available on my website, smartfaith.net, where you can also subscribe to my weekly blog. Well, thanks for watching episode 17. Please check out episode 18, and in the meantime, have a great day.